if something's come out wrong, we'll sing a happy song, and you can...
Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog is surprisingly personal. It tells the story of Billy, aka Dr. Horrible, an aspiring supervillain brimming with righteous indignation at society and his own social isolation. Billy is desperate to join the Evil League of Evil, led by the nefarious Bad Horse. Meanwhile, he's fixated on Penny, played by Felicia Day, a charitable and generous neighbor who he is basically stalking. Written by Joss Whedon, his brother Jed, and his now sister-in-law Marissa Tancherone. During the 2008 writer's strike, Dr. Horrible is Whedon's most independent work, and it is not an unmitigated success. A lot of people grew up feeling like Joss was one of them, and the sentiment of Dr. Horrible is for them. Whedon's works usually have a character, a Xander, a Topher, a Coulson, a Marty, that seems to reflect Whedon and, through him, that part of the audience. Billy is the only one that Whedon made the main protagonist. Its heart is in the right place. Joss, who spent his career validating dweebs, seems to want to say that validation is good, but it isn't always good. You can build an identity out of being angry and isolated from society, but that doesn't make that identity good. Sometimes you need to be told by someone you feel deeply has been where you are. This isn't healthy, not for the people you know, and not for you. A lot of nerd culture's biggest names have always felt like tourists. It's not like nerds minded, but Patrick Stewart can't turn to nerds and say, listen, build things of your own. Care for your friends and family. Go outside sometimes, nod and be listened to and welcomed, and I'm not sure how many people besides Joss Whedon could. Well, I can think of one.
Get in the Ava.
But here Joss was, saying it, making it fun and good, and trying. Coming back to it now, my problem is Penny.
We have a problem with her.
Wait, bear with me for a second. Billy wants two things. He wants to join the Evil League of Evil and take over the world, and he wants Penny, who's perfect and moral and kind, but dating his nemesis Captain Hammer, and then she dies, and it's sad, and that's it. Penny has less of an inner life than Moist, who's moist. Penny has less of an inner life than Bad Horse, and Bad Horse is, to be very clear, a horse, a bad horse. It's possibly the most sexy lamp plotting ever, but let's go past that. In this rebuttal of nice guy assholery, the story never once thinks Billy's problem is that he doesn't empathize with Penny or care what she wants. That is Billy's problem, but it's the story's problem too. Billy doesn't get what he wants, but Dr. Horrible never advances an actual thematic rebuttal to his nice guyism. It all has the feeling of a kind of deeply felt but self-obsessed progressive male attitude toward women, invested in women symbolically, but not entirely aware that women are real people that really exist. In the musical commentary track, written by Joss and Jed Whedon, Felicia Day is given one song. It's all about the art. Parodies the idea that Day should be treated seriously as an actress. She is portrayed as bumbling, silly, and comically attracted to Nathan Fillion. My tortured actor's process, she sings, stand here and do what Joss says. I don't know who Joss Whedon is in his heart. The allegations about him, some of which he has admitted, suggest a verbally abusive director who uses humiliating tactics and racially and sexually abusive language when he feels saddled with creative partners he doesn't respect and who leveraged his position to have sexual relationships with subordinates. Whedon's own defense has been an unclear quasi-denial, accepting the broad characterization, rejecting many of the worst accusations, and discussing personal issues that would explain but not excuse that behavior. I won't tell you how to feel about that. Hollywood has a lot of different kinds of assholes. Child abusers, apologists for dictators, senior cult figures. So it's fair to draw your personal line just about anywhere. And if Whedon is across yours, that's absolutely fair enough, and I'm not here to offer either indictment or apologia of the man. The work was important to me at the time. For a while, in perfect parallel to what people call the mainstreaming of nerd culture, Whedon's work seemed really important to everyone. So I want to try to talk about the work.
I think boys are more interested in a girl who can talk.
You really haven't been dating lately.
Buffy was just a few years too early for me. I didn't have a frame of reference for Buffy's high school adventures. Coming back to it, it has a lot of strengths and many excellent episodes. And I will not be the first person to say, for example, that The Body is one of the finest episodes of television I've struggled to watch. But because the show stays laser focused on Buffy's personal struggles and the fantastical metaphor for them, the show is strong across the board for many seasons in a way that today's CW peers really aren't. Arrow and its spin-offs, The Vampire Diaries, Riverdale, The 100. I don't think it's controversial to say, from a perspective of storytelling craft, Buffy leaves them all in the dust. There are so many basically good decisions you can miss because they're so trivially right, in a way that underscores how often more ordinary work chickens out and does it wrong. Not everything that attracts our criticism is necessarily a choice made by its creators, and works are constrained by audience expectations, by genre, by practicality, by budget, by time, and the network teen drama is one of the most constrained art forms there is along every one of those axes. And in Buffy, as in later, Whedon surpassed its standards by far. In someone else's Buffy, she would have been dating Xander by the start of season 3, but that's not right for the characters, so it doesn't happen. Buffy graduates, dies, has depression, and flips burgers at a fast food place. At all times, her character and her character's progression is given full respect. When one of Buffy's friends realizes she's gay, it's not a short, heartwarming story arc followed by that character fading away. The writers unable to either continue to honor it or back out of it. No, they stick with it, and it's not really for me. Buffy's not, Glee, but it still feels like a show for people that, for all that they think they had a bad time in high school, feel a ton of nostalgia about high school. I look at Willow, Xander, and Buffy, the nerd, the fuck-up, and the outcast, and I know I'm supposed to see myself represented there, but I don't because they're doing fine. That's not how I was doing. And seeing those characters so clearly meant to represent me, it feels immediately like a dude being relatable by sitting in his chair backwards.
So, you got detention. You screwed up.
A quick aside about Buffy speak. The mimetic sensibility about Joss Whedon's dialogue, that it's filled with neologisms, catchphrases, and snappy gags, it isn't actually true. Whedon has a strong, maybe too strong, sense of when to cut tension with humor, but in general, one of Whedon's strengths is his ability to preserve a distinct voice for every character. Buffy and her friends talk like 90s SoCal teenagers because that's what they are, which within the show reflects a key thematic distinction by separating them from people who are generationally different and so speak differently, people like Giles, Angel, Spike, and Joyce. By Angel, the spin-off show, the only character who talks that way is Buffy's classmate Cordelia. Anyway, in the 5th season, Buffy suddenly has a younger sister, a character invented by magic for Buffy to protect. But when the characters realize that Dawn wasn't always there, it doesn't really change anything. She's still Buffy's little sister, and this is Buffy's triumph. Any of this show's peers would write Dawn out by the end of the season. She'd use her tremendous magical power to save Buffy and friends from something, and she'd fade out in a burst of light, and then she'd get mentioned once in the next season, and never be heard from again. But that's not how Buffy rolls. Angel is a vampire cursed with a soul, but In the metaphor of the show, Buffy's supernatural adventures represent her coming into adulthood, learning about her inner strength, and bringing her strength to bear on the struggles of growing up. So, Angel is a charming older man who seems to authentically care for Buffy, to respect her, and then as soon as he's gotten what he came for, he turns vicious, sheds that facade, and reveals that he only sees her as prey. It's brutally effective storytelling. And then the show forgives Angel. It loses track of the metaphor and going, no, it's true love, lands somewhere a lot closer to Twilight. And eventually the show shunts Angel off to his own spin-off and replaces him with Spike. It's a good choice. They fit into the show's relationships and story in a very similar way, but Spike has a better chemistry with Buffy. The same fixation, but with a layer of vaguely amusing whininess that at least gives it some character. But there's a characterization red flag when a character's inner life revolves entirely around a single other character. That's true of Spike as it was of Angel, and the show's increasing focus on Spike draws attention to, on the one hand, how that coming-of-age supernatural metaphor was supplanted by a less thematically deep urban fantasy, and on the other hand, a certain maleness. A transition from telling a story within Buffy's perspective and with a deep empathy for Buffy to a story about Buffy with a fixation on how men relate to women. Especially older, damaged men feeling a purifying love for younger women. A trope that's certainly all over our culture, but that's weird to see in a show that specifically ran that topic through a wood chipper back in season 1. But here we are in the show's sweeping conclusion, the culmination of Buffy's coming of age, and a huge amount of this conclusion is actually devoted to Spike.
That must be in hell.
No, LA, but a lot of people make that mistake.
Given his own show, Angel works way better. His fixation on Buffy was unsympathetic, and also Angel doesn't really have a sense of humor, so a lot of the scenes he shares with Buffy tend to drag. In his own show, Angel can be surrounded by funnier supporting characters who play off him better. The cast is partly drawn from cast-offs from Buffy, and they pretty much uniformly shine in a show that can give them more space to develop. Cordelia, Wesley, Darla, and eventually Spike and Harmony are all more engaging characters here. If the building blocks of Buffy's fantasy are the experiences of being a teenager, Angel's are those of being an adult. Angel and his colleagues struggle with work, money, exes, children, friends who let you down, and of course, trying to figure out how to be good in a world that's a lot more complicated than it used to seem. It is a noir, after all. Angel's new home is called the Hyperion Hotel. This is not the land of subtlety. During the second season, Angel abandons his colleagues and attempts to get to the Hell Dimension where he can find and confront the demonic senior partners of the evil law firm Wolfram and Hart. Again, not the land of subtlety. When finally he gets their attention, he's invited to visit their home, and he gets in the elevator determined to finish all this once and for all, and then this happens.
Welcome to the home office.
The world of Angel has got its hell dimensions, but the source of evil is people. Mean, cruel people. The humans Angel was trying to protect were the source of everything he was trying to protect them from. But that devastating realization gives way to, clarity. You can't pick up a sword and kill evil in heroic combat. Fighting evil is doing what you can about what's in front of your face.
All I want to do is help. I want to help because I don't think people should suffer as they do.
Whedon was a little more hands-off with Angel. Occupied by Buffy and then by Firefly, he oversaw Angel but wrote and directed only a handful of its episodes. Whedon gave Angel more attention during its 5th season, and many believe Whedon's fractious relationship with the WB is what led to Angel's surprise cancellation. And then during the build-up to that memorable ending, Whedon again departed to go make Serenity. And if you're imagining that that distance means that Angel is spared some of the weirder Joss Whedon gender stuff, well, I won't tell you how both of the series' main female characters die painfully birthing ancient evil goddesses, or that the show's next most prominent female character kills herself in childbirth so that Angel can have a son, or how the series' other female lead, the one you forgot about, also attempts suicide, only for Angel to miraculously rescue her, her entire arc coming to a single moment of symbolic redemption for Angel, after which she immediately disappears from the story entirely and without explanation.
Now this is all the money Niska gave us in advance.
I'm good. Let's think for everyone. I'm right there with you.
It's important to keep some perspective. There are reasonable criticisms of Firefly. It's true that in a setting that's supposed to be heavily Chinese inflected, there are no actors of Chinese or even Asian descent in the main cast. Is that a fault? Yes. Is it a grievous fault? It's a budget network show trying to describe a multicultural future, and any element of Orientalism is remarkably restrained, and the cast isn't whitewashed. Whedon makes every character seem distinct, makes them speak with authentic and distinct voices. For a production of its genre, medium, and time, Firefly is remarkably diverse and even cosmopolitan. It's true that within the Western framework, Mal, the lead protagonist, is an unrepentant Confederate soldier headed west to escape the encroaching hand of the Union, and that's not great. Especially because the Alliance, which stands in for the Union, is explicitly coded in the text as a totalitarian, oppressive state. Whedon has said that one of his inspirations was The Killer Angels, the famed novel about the Battle of Gettysburg, and that tracks. The Killer Angels is an important work, but it consciously abstracts away the causes of the war, and lionizes people who are indisputably some of American history's greatest villains. If it's not quite a lost cause story itself, it's clearly one of the leading texts of the feckless, isn't war the true evil ambivalence that gave the lost cause such a pass in American culture. Firefly inherits a lot of that, and explicitly sympathizes with Mal's states' rightsy ideology, but Firefly doesn't seem to have been intended to be perfectly a Western or quite as far on the Western side of space Western as it landed. Squeezing against its budget constraints, Firefly rarely returns to the expensively cool, populated settings glimpsed in its pilot episode, spending a lot of time out in those California and Nevada deserts familiar from so many Westerns. The other half of the show that's supposed to contain the more high-concept sci-fi, where River and Inara and Book's subplots are, with the parts of the story that appear in Serenity, isn't really in Firefly. So the show comes across as 90% Western instead of 50% Western, and so a character like Mal probably looks more like a straight iteration of a shitty archetype than was intended. And it's true that Mal's denigration of Inara's profession is weird.
Must be rich, to afford your rates.
I suppose. He has engaged me for several days.
Days? Boy must have stamina.
Inara is a sex worker, and Mal's righteous disapproval of her trade fits a stock character dynamic. The white hat Western hero ought to try to rescue her from that kind of life, but it's out of place and parochial in this specific setting. Inara's profession isn't just legal in the setting, it's prestigious and glamorous. When rich asshole Atherton Wing goes to a ball with her, the writers make a point of showing that Inara is a respected and distinguished member of that society.
Colonel Cyrus Mumpson and escort. Atherton Wing and Inara Sarah.
Only one other character has any problem at all with Inara's profession, Book, who's briefly wrong-footed and then swiftly befriends her.
I brought you some supper, but if you'd prefer a lecture, I've a few very catchy ones prepped.
As a creative choice, it's frustrating because it infects their dynamic, and there is this dynamic that the couple of times it shines through works great, where two people with very different personalities and very different cultures and a simmering attraction are trying to run two different, sometimes conflicting, businesses out of one ship. But the show blankets it with this layer of moral judgment that just takes the legs out of any romantic tension it wants Mal and Inara to have, because Mal is using slurs and insulting Inara all the time, and the show is way too concerned with the distinction Mal draws between respecting Inara and respecting her profession.
I might not show respect to your job, but he didn't respect you. That's the difference.
A distinction that plays as just an excuse to use those slurs and insults, but not mean it. Likewise, the show bends over too far to lionize Mal's noble chastity in his encounters with Saffron. At the same time, beyond that, Firefly sex workers are given a ludicrously progressive and, more than that, human portrayal for 2002, or indeed for 2022. Not just Inara, but also Nandi, the madam who features in the second-to-last episode. Firefly makes them the heroes of their own stories, motivated and proactive characters, and it normalizes sex work without obscuring its dangers or those dangers' sources. The show's occasional fixation on the violence men do to women feels appropriate here in a space western and in a production that also has a lot of other stories featuring men and women. River is kind of a prop character in the episodes that exist, but I think it's clear this wouldn't have remained true forever. In keeping with Whedon's ability to give every character their own authentic voice, Inara, Zoe, Kaylee, and River all come across as distinct human beings with personalities, relationships, backgrounds, and motivations. Trying to avoid cancellation, Firefly rushes through its best ideas and half its planned story arcs in 14 episodes, so most of the intended turns, Book being a government operative, Inara's incurable illness, the Reavers being created by the Alliance, were already predictable by the end of the show. That's not a sin, rather the show stumbles across a really good pace that it probably wouldn't have had with more flexibility. It also looks phenomenal, not just for its time, but even set against prestige streaming dramas of 2022. Making the production this professional on these budget constraints is really impressive, and you can compare shows like Babylon 5 and Star Trek Voyager to get a sense of just how much of a leap forward from that Firefly really is. Between that and snappy writing, great characters, and a cool universe, Firefly doesn't just kinda hold up. It is a startlingly good show. Anyway, in the episode Janestown, Jane accidentally does something great and becomes the object of a community's adoration. At first he takes advantage of them, but eventually he feels guilty. When his lie is revealed, he tries to dissuade them, but they just go back to adoring him, and Mal explains having fans isn't about you, really. All celebrities are assholes. It's just something that people need. As for the sequel movie, Serenity isn't as good as Firefly, but it's still very fun. Whedon struggles bringing themes to bear, more on that later, but the bigger issue is that trying to cram way too many plot beats and character introductions and deaths and dramatic proclamations into 119 minutes. Whedon's biggest strength, that extraordinarily human characterization, just gets squeezed out. He tries to give every major character their own arc, and that's commendable, but there's a 9-person ensemble cast and a new villain, so none of them are adequately developed before their dramatic payoffs, and you do get stuff like Inara just wandering through the back half of the movie with some kind of laser bow. But despite all that, Firefly operating at 85% is still really good.
Everything go all right with the wipe?
Why don't you just ask Echo? Oh, that's right, because she can't remember.
I bet you forgot about Dollhouse. I did watch it at the time and try to make excuses for it. Okay, if you didn't watch it, the concept is that this woman, Echo, has agreed, sort of, to have her memory wiped by a corporation that then downloads personas into her. And then people, mostly men, will hire her to fulfill some fantasy or perform some service for them. It's an interesting idea, but I don't think the concept works as a serial once the show reveals its central premise a few minutes into the pilot, how Echo is being abused, how many of these mind-wipe adventures am I supposed to be interested in watching Echo have? I don't know if the answer is 0 or 1, but it can't possibly be more than 1. It might be a cool starting point for a movie. It sets up a character who, when something happens that helps her remember who she is, will have resonant motivations and goals. But in a serial, if you ever do that, you have to promptly reverse it or stop making the show. One problem, I'm afraid, is Eliza Dushku, an actress whose work I typically quite like, but if the conceit is that Echo will have a new persona every episode, there's a clear need for a performer with a ton of range who can really show that off, and I'm sorry, Dushku doesn't. A big problem is that Echo's not a character, which means the show can never inhabit her perspective, just the perspective of personas that aren't her, and are fundamentally assaults on her personhood. In some of these shows, Whedon's interest in topics of objectification, men mistreating women, men seeing women more as property than as people is all lensed through this extraordinarily empathic characterization and a determination to keep those women's perspectives both human and foregrounded. But Dollhouse can't give Echo that characterization or show you Echo's perspective because she can't have either, which makes the show feel roughly the same kind of male self-obsession it's criticizing. It's angry that bad men treat women as property, but it's voyeuristically just as interested in depicting their fantasies, and just as disinterested in women as people. Dollhouse tries to suggest Echo and the other dolls are slowly waking up, but within the serial format, this can't really come to anything. So by late in the first season, the show is already starting to abandon serial storytelling in favor of something more like a sci-fi conspiracy thriller. This, in turn, pushes the story away from the dolls and onto the people doing the exploiting. And from a basic structural perspective, it leaves the plot running through a series of nonsensical adventures and machinations, like sci-fi Lost without the cultural cachet. So, Alias. And while Dollhouse was cancelled long before that story could come to anything, I've never come across any community of Dollhouse browncoats insisting it ended too soon.
Society needs to crumble. We're all just too chicken shit to let it.
I've missed your rants.
You will come to see things my way.
I won't go too deep on The Cabin in the Woods. It's heavily Whedon-inflected, but I'm trying to stick to stuff he both wrote and directed, so I'll just say it doesn't really work for me. As a send-up of teen horror staples, it's well thought through, well structured, and often clever, but also kinda lightweight. The critique of how formulaic teen horror became is clear, but it's in the awkward position of being insightful and mentionable, but not really plausibly influential, because what are you going to do with any of this? I like many of the ideas and character bits and some of the gags, but for me it has the same sort of problem as Walk Hard. The gag is clever and funny, but not funny over and over again for 90 minutes. It's a classic SNL skit and its slightly unnecessary sequel, and every other time they drag the bit back out and you just wish they'd let it die. Whedon's cachet peaked when nerd cultures peaked, the moment when Hollywood realized they should actually take advantage of the financial success of superhero movies by making tons of them, which is to say, The Avengers. The Avengers.
That's what we call ourselves, sort of like a team. Earth's mightiest heroes type thing.
Yes, I've met them.
Takes us a while to get any traction, I'll give you that one.
It is a fantastically well-directed movie, in terms of getting every shot right. In a time before Marvel felt comfortable putting heavy CG in every shot, movies like this had to assemble workable scenes with clever angles and cuts, connecting practical shots to effects shots, and The Avengers nails it. And there are so many great creative touches, like here, Steve's civilian costuming, that reflect Whedon's ability to make every shot, every scene, authentically and interestingly reflect the characters. A lot of these movies more or less repeat characters' arcs over and over again to preserve the resonance. The Avengers, on the other hand, is invested in building on the progress the characters have already made. Thor and Tony are struggling with the complications of their previous movies, and the Avengers imagines Cap struggling with adapting to modernity in a way that feels more authentic and far less contrived than the dedicated bits devoted to that subject in The Winter Soldier. The reality is that many of these characters are better characterized in these movies than they are in any of their other appearances. Natasha, who has zero actual characterization besides punches good up to this point, has more successful character beats in the Avengers than she will ever get again, including in her own movie. Clint has more successful character beats in Age of Ultron than he'll ever get again, including in his own show.
None of this makes sense. But I'm going back out there because it's my job. Okay, and I can't do my job and babysit.
Whedon does often slightly overplay a comic bit, lean on it just one beat too far. For example, the gag about Coulson's trading cards is great here.
Did he ask you to sign his Captain America trading cards yet?
Trading cards?
They're vintage.
But by here?
It's a vintage set. Took me a couple of years to collect them all.
It's too much. Even so, even 10 years after half the jokes in it got mined for memes, The Avengers remains authentically hilarious.
Well, let me know if Real Power wants a magazine or something.
The MCU picked up Iron Man's grounded, bantery realism without showing an understanding of how that style reflected Iron Man's specific storytelling goals. The same is true of the Avengers' low-stakes comedic storytelling. The Avengers accurately reads what stakes are plausible in this their first team-up movie. The Avengers are not going to die here, so trying to make you believe it is not productive. Instead, it wants you to ask about their relationships, about whether they'll succeed at moral tests, about how bad they'll let things get before they solve their problems. To do this, it turns into a sports movie. The 2000 movie Remember the Titans tells the heavily fictionalized story of the football team of T.C. Williams High School in its first season after integration. Racial tensions between the players and the coaches leads to escalating conflict, but chasing a championship with unfair pressure from officials and facing personal tragedy, they ultimately come together and win.
Together.
And that's how The Avengers works too. Whedon also shows a phenomenal sense of setup and payoff across all his work, but my favorite example is in Age of Ultron. You remember that comedy scene with a hammer? The scene that got the whole MCU discourse obsessed with whether Steve might be able to hold it? What that scene is for is, later in the movie, the plot is going to need the team and the audience to immediately trust Vision, even though Vision and Ultron were made the same way. So here we set up that only worthy people can lift the hammer, with jokes and character beats and introducing Ultron so you're not bored. And here, this feels like an easy joke, but it's reminding you other people can't lift the hammer. And then, here, Vision lifts the hammer, and you have that moment of, oh shit, yeah. But we're not done, because Vision lifting the hammer sets up here. This kind of thing is all over these movies, and it sews them together in a way a lot of superhero movies just aren't. There are a couple of things about the Avengers that are a little trashy, like the way Pepper and Natasha are introduced, but that's hardly specifically Joss, and both these scenes have more effective characterization for Pepper and Natasha than you've seen in any of their previous appearances, so you're gonna have to wait until Age of Ultron to get to hear Joss Whedon talk about wombs. I guess in college or something, Whedon was introduced to a concept, a relatively fringe and pretty antiquated concept as far as I can tell in Freudian psychology called womb envy. Basically the idea that the core of the way men relate to women is that men feel emasculated by women having something they lack, the ability to create life. Whedon is described being profoundly affected by this idea, and I guess we all have some ideas we heard somewhere that really resonated with us, even if we didn't understand the deep and ongoing school of scholarship that we took a tiny puzzle piece out of. It's a little weird to think of Joss Whedon hearing this idea that men feel really envious of women's wombs and going, oh yes, that feels really right, because, no, and speak for yourself. But I also am not here to criticize that idea on philosophical grounds, and many of Whedon's works like Buffy allied that idea into a sort of general evocative statement of empowerment and liberation of young women. But when two main female characters in Angel die giving birth to two different evil goddesses, that's there. When there was a planned episode for Firefly where Inara gives herself something that causes her to poison a bunch of Reavers as they gang rape her, okay, that episode was never actually going to get made, but just hearing about it, that's there. When the scientists of Alien Resurrection create Ripley so that she can mother aliens and her gift to the aliens is a human reproductive system, that's there. When Whedon's unproduced Wonder Woman script centers on a magic chain that binds Wonder Woman and drains her power, that's there. And here, when Age of Ultron is suddenly really interested in whether Natasha can have children, that's here too. I want to be careful here because Whedon inherited a ludicrously underrepresentative cinematic universe. Iron Man and Captain America have only one female cast member each, both love interests and neither actually necessary to those movies' plots. Avengers is already batting well above average for Marvel, and Age of Ultron has 4 significant female characters, all of whom read as distinct characters with different roles in the story. Wanda is by some distance the deepest and most successful female character in the franchise to this point, and more or less the lead protagonist of the actual story. Age of Ultron wants to build on where its characters actually are, and when it turns to Cap and Thor and Tony, it's on firm ground, but when it turns to Natasha, it doesn't have much to work with, and that's not on Joss. That's highlighting how little the MCU's other creators have given him. But with just a few scenes of space and needing to come up with something, he immediately went, oh, it's her womb. Patriarchy fucked with her womb, and that trauma defines her, as if everyone would pick that up, nod along, go, sure, that tracks, and go right back to the yuck jokes. It's absolutely a thing you could explore with sensitivity and care, but Age of Ultron doesn't explore it at all. Doesn't seem aware that these heavy ideas require any scaffolding. It just sticks them next to Cap and Thor's action figure sadnesses and goes back to the joking. Finally, Age of Ultron is a story about authorities doing something wildly stupid and ludicrously overreaching in the name of public safety, calling forth a horrible villain that comes back to bite them in the ass. But then, that's the story of the Avengers, and Serenity, and Alien Resurrection, and the unproduced Wonder Woman script, and from a certain angle, The Cabin in the Woods. It's no great sin to have a pet theme, and the overreach of security officials is definitely, topical, but across so many repetitions, Whedon has done very little with it. The persistent sci-fi distance is a problem. Most people agree that there are hypothetically some lines that security officials shouldn't cross. Whedon's movies argue that using alien magic to create an army of out-of-control killer robots is on the wrong side of that line, just like breeding alien murder machines, or dosing an entire planet with an experimental brain-altering drug, or using Nazi magic to open a portal to distant space on the grounds that it produces clean energy. What I'm saying is, these are not productive ways to engage that topic, and if Whedon were deeply interested, surely at least once he would have sought some more useful framing. On the other hand, I'm not sure they're supposed to be. After all, Whedon's writing is at its strongest delivering character beats and interactions. The generic, essentially likable, totally inapplicable theme ends up just being part of the structure, as solved as having 3 acts. It's there and it's familiar and you can let it slide past you while you enjoy the parts that Whedon is truly great at. Hollywood will uncancel anyone who will make them some money, but 5 years after Justice League, it looks like they can do without Joss. In 2020, in the middle of the wave of allegations about Whedon, he left his then current project, a television series about magical women, and occasionally men, in Victorian London. And I remember feeling about that, well, no great loss. Maybe that's a mean thing to say. But do you really think Joss's version of that show was going to go anywhere that 7 years of Buffy hadn't already been? Maybe he just feels less special today. In 2022, sometimes telling female-led stories, occasionally even having women kiss, is something studios do to market to viewers, not the forefront of representation. Nickelodeon even let Cora hold hands with a girl, as long as it was in the last episode and therefore didn't require any televised follow-up. There's basically an entire TV network devoted to telling weird supernatural coming-of-age stories. Maybe that normalcy draws your attention to the few things that aren't sanded off for mass consumption. I'm not sure. Either way, yeah, much of Whedon's work is incredibly well crafted, not just as a writer, though he has a phenomenal skill for the mechanics of writing, but also as a director, having transitioned from low-budget television to the biggest of blockbuster films with what seems like an instinctive mastery of the tools available. Most of his work absolutely holds up today in a way that, say, most of the Arrowverse absolutely won't in the 2040s. But I'm 20 cough years older than I was when I started watching this stuff, and in the end, I'm not sure he is. As much as I remain fond of so much of what we've discussed here, I don't find myself exactly mourning the unfulfilled work he may never get to. I'm pretty sure I've already seen it.